XRP is about to receive one of the biggest upgrades we've seen in years. And if history repeats itself, this could become the catalyst that finally puts XRP back in the spotlight. Most investors are still looking at XRP the old way. They think the entire story depends on Ripple signing another partnership, announcing another bank deal, or landing another major institution. But what if the next phase of XRP has nothing to do with waiting? Because right now, a major upgrade is preparing to unlock something that could completely change how XRP is used across the XRP ledger. And here's what most people aren't paying attention to. At the exact same time we're seeing regulatory clarity move closer, real-world assets flow onto the XRP ledger faster than ever before, and new infrastructure being built that could unlock entirely new opportunities for XRP holders. This isn't just another Ripple announcement, this is about utility. This is about liquidity. And this is about why many believe the next major XRP move could start sooner than most people expect. Let's break it down. For years, XRP investors have been told the same story. Wait for the next partnership. Wait for the next bank. Wait for the next institution. Wait for Ripple to sign another deal. And while those developments absolutely matter, many people have started viewing XRP as nothing more than a passive investment that sits in a wallet waiting for something big to happen. But the XRP ledger is evolving far beyond that. What we're seeing today is the development of an entire ecosystem where XRP isn't just held, it's used, it's moved, it's paired with assets, it's utilized for liquidity, and soon it may be actively working for holders in ways that weren't previously possible. Now, before we get into the lending protocol itself, let's talk about why momentum around XRP has been growing recently. Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse recently made it clear that after spending years in the crypto industry, he knows when a moment is real. And according to him, this is one of those moments. He pointed to several developments converging at the same time: growing institutional adoption, increasing real-world utility, the continued expansion of the XRP Ledger, and for the first time ever, Ripple, Swell, and Apex coming together during the same event later this year in New York City. Think about that. After years of building infrastructure behind the scenes, Ripple is now talking about scale. Not future possibilities, not theoretical use cases, scale. And that's a very different conversation. Because infrastructure only becomes valuable when people actually start using it. And that's exactly what appears to be happening. Another development that caught attention recently involved Ripple being featured by the New York Stock Exchange. Now think about how significant that is. This wasn't a crypto influencer discussing XRP. This wasn't a blockchain podcast. This was the New York Stock Exchange highlighting Ripple's role in digital asset infrastructure. And during that discussion, Ripple's leadership explained how the company now offers a complete digital asset stack: payments, custody, stablecoins, tokenization, treasury solutions, and infrastructure designed specifically for financial institutions. But perhaps the most important point wasn't what Ripple offers, it was how long they've been building. For more than a decade, Ripple has been working directly with financial institutions around the world. And unlike many companies that are still trying to establish credibility, Ripple has spent years obtaining licenses and regulatory approvals across multiple jurisdictions. Why does that matter? Because institutions don't move billions of dollars based on hype. They move when trust exists. And trust is built over time. But here's where things start getting really interesting. Because while many investors focus only on XRP's daily price movement, something much larger has been happening underneath the surface. Real-world assets are rapidly moving onto the XRP ledger. According to recent data, the XRP ledger has led major blockchain networks in real-world asset inflows over the last 90 days, excluding stablecoins. That's a massive development, because tokenization has become one of the biggest narratives in finance. And we're not talking about speculation. We're talking about actual assets being brought on-chain. Now, some people hear that and immediately ask the obvious question. If all of this is happening, why isn't XRP exploding higher already? And honestly, that's a fair question. But it also reveals something important. Many investors only look at the final result. They don't look at the process. Because bringing assets onto a blockchain is only the first step. First, the assets arrive. Then liquidity forms around those assets. Then trading activity begins expanding between those assets. And eventually, entire financial ecosystems begin operating around them. We're still early in that process. The assets are arriving, the infrastructure is being built, and the liquidity foundations are forming. But the story doesn't end there. Because the next upgrade may be even more important than tokenization itself. And this is where the XRP Lending Protocol enters the conversation. Because if tokenization brings assets onto the XRP ledger, the lending protocol could unlock something completely different. It could unlock the ability for XRP holders to put idle capital to work. And that's where things could get very interesting. Now here's where the story becomes much more interesting. Because tokenization alone isn't what could change the game for XRP holders. The real shift happens when those assets start interacting with liquidity across the XRP ledger. And that's exactly why so much attention is now turning toward the XRP Lending Protocol. Recently, one of the XRP Ledger validators highlighted something that many people completely overlooked. According to the validator, the XRP Lending Protocol has gone through the most extensive testing process ever completed for an XRP Ledger amendment. Think about that for a second. Not one of the most tested, the most tested. And that's important because when you're talking about lending, borrowing, liquidity, and yield generation, security becomes everything. Over the past year, the protocol has gone through multiple independent audits, public testing events, bug bounty programs, validator reviews, and formal verification processes. The goal wasn't simply to launch quickly. The goal was to make sure the system could operate safely before it ever reached users. Several vulnerabilities were discovered, several issues were identified, and according to the testing reports, all of those findings were addressed before moving forward. Why does that matter? Because if you've been around crypto long enough, you've seen what happens when protocols launch before they're ready. Billions of dollars have been lost across the industry due to smart contract exploits, bridge failures, and security weaknesses. But the XRP Ledger has always taken a different approach, and this is where many investors are starting to pay closer attention. Unlike many DeFi systems that rely heavily on complicated smart contracts and external bridges, the lending functionality being developed here is designed directly into the XRP Ledger ecosystem itself. That doesn't mean risk disappears. Nothing in finance is risk-free, but it does show the level of attention being placed on creating infrastructure that institutions and everyday users can actually trust. And trust is becoming one of the most valuable assets in the entire digital asset industry. Now here's the question many XRP holders are asking. Why is this such a big deal? Why would lending and borrowing suddenly attract attention to XRP? The answer is actually pretty simple, because for years, millions of dollars worth of XRP have simply been sitting idle. Investors buy XRP, they store it, and then they wait, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. But what happens when those same holders suddenly have new ways to put those assets to work? What happens when holding XRP becomes more than simply hoping for price appreciation? This is the part many investors are starting to focus on, because once lending markets mature, participants may have opportunities to earn yield, access liquidity, or utilize their assets in ways that weren't previously available. And when that happens, XRP starts becoming more than just a speculative asset. It starts becoming part of a functioning financial ecosystem. That's a completely different narrative, and narratives matter. We've seen this before throughout crypto history. Markets often move when a new use case captures attention. Sometimes it's NFTs, sometimes it's staking, sometimes it's DeFi, sometimes it's tokenization. The market constantly searches for the next major trend, and right now XRP is positioning itself at the intersection of several powerful trends at once. Tokenization, institutional adoption, regulatory clarity, and now potentially lending and yield opportunities. That's a combination that investors simply can't ignore forever. But here's what many people still miss. The lending protocol isn't really the final destination. It's another building block, a very important one, but still a building block. Because once tokenized assets arrive, once liquidity begins flowing, once lending markets develop, and once regulatory clarity improves, the entire ecosystem becomes more attractive to participants. More developers start building, more institutions start exploring, more liquidity enters the network, and gradually the value proposition becomes stronger. This doesn't happen overnight, and that's something worth remembering. The market often expects immediate results, but infrastructure development usually comes first. Price tends to follow later. We've already seen real-world assets moving onto the XRP Ledger. We've already seen Ripple expanding its institutional footprint. We've already seen growing conversations around regulatory clarity, and now we're seeing another major piece of infrastructure moving closer to reality. That's why many investors believe this moment feels different. Not because of one announcement, not because of one partnership, not because of one headline, but because multiple developments are beginning to align at the same time. And when enough pieces start falling into place, markets eventually take notice. Now, does this guarantee an XRP bull run tomorrow? Of course not. Nobody can guarantee that. But what it does show is that the foundation for future growth continues getting stronger. And that's ultimately what long-term investors watch most closely. Because the biggest moves often happen after years of quiet building, not when everyone is already paying attention. And that's really the key takeaway from today's update. The XRP story is evolving. It's becoming bigger than partnerships, bigger than headlines, and bigger than simply waiting for someone else to create value. We're watching an ecosystem expand. We're watching utility increase. And we're watching new opportunities emerge for XRP holders that simply didn't exist before. Whether this becomes the catalyst that starts the next major XRP run remains to be seen. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The XRP ledger is continuing to grow, continue to attract new activity, and continue to build toward a future that looks very different from where it was just a few years ago. And that's exactly why so many investors are paying attention right now. If you enjoyed today's update, make sure to like the video, subscribe to XRP Update, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our future XRP coverage. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next update.